truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, June 10th, 2024, the 1237th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast through a paid subscription at I'mYourModerator.substack.com. With a paid subscription, you get the ad-free experience. You can participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you are invited to participate in the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on a wide variety of podcast platforms, including Substack and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so we focused a big chunk of last week on elections abroad, one in Mexico, one in India. And on the heels of those elections, we have elections for the European Union Parliament, the results of which are being billed to the world as some great win for the far right and a loss for centrists and moderates who are expected to attempt to form coalitions with the far left in order to prevent the far right from rising to power across Europe, certain to join the far right from the United States rising to power, with Donald Trump being presented as the new Hitler and his MAGA supporters being presented as Nazis. And we're going to discuss those elections more in the days to come, probably tomorrow. But we'll have elections coming soon in France and then in the UK just days later. It seems like we are going to get a major rerun of the 2016 Brexit narrative across Europe to match the Donald Trump win in America. And as we discussed on Thursday with India's elections, that top line result, the face of the dissenting faction, the victorious winner, Narendra Modi, will be used to shift focus, obscuring the fact that down ballot, the regime got what it wanted. The election apparatus itself will go unquestioned because the man with the prominent face was declared the winner. I have suggested for months now that it looks like that's the strategy that will be pursued here if indeed we have an election this fall. And so my plan is to get to that tomorrow. We'll do India elections and then the EU elections, unless something dramatic happens between now and then. I mean, I've been saying I'm going to talk about Russia for a week now. I am actually going to do that today. But before we get into that, I want to reiterate that the purpose of spending so much time on geopolitics is that it's easy to see the good twin versus evil twin dynamic worldwide in a way that might be a little bit easier to understand, a little more visible, a little more obvious when we don't have our own personal biases that are connected with the politics of this country to distract us from the bigger picture understanding of which direction things are going relative to that tug of war we see worldwide between the powers of centralization toward that one world international liberal rules-based order and the powers of decentralization toward sovereign leaders of sovereign nations protecting sovereign national interests and the individual sovereignty of the people. And that centralization versus decentralization dynamic is replicated in the financial realm as well, as things move away from the global regime's fiat bankers printing their fiat currency from nothing, currently branded and represented as the American dollar. And to continue that trend, the push for central bank digital currencies and the decentralized approach opposite that toward Bitcoin, potentially maybe other cryptocurrencies, maybe a basket of currencies, maybe something gold backed, including maybe an American dollar backed by gold or backed by Bitcoin, just the purpose being that the creation of currency is clawed away from those global central bankers and distributed at least among nations, and hopefully in steps well beyond that to the people themselves, allowing, at least theoretically, the possibility of an era of far greater sovereignty to come. But today, let's focus in on Russia, which of course means we will be discussing Ukraine and what seems to be the collapse of the regime's project there, and then some of the currency stuff and Russia's role in the world. They just hosted last week the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which is basically the multipolar alternative to the World Economic Forum, which represents that centralizing force. So let's start with Reuters a couple weeks back. This is May 31st. Blinken says Washington approved use of U.S. weapons by Ukraine inside Russia. Throughout all the psyops, throughout all the scare events, throughout all the reported terrorist attacks, the ghost of Kyiv, Snake Island, drones exploding into the sides of ships, CIA-trained Nazi battalions, the sharing of intelligence, the funding, the arming, the planning, the targeting of Russian officials for assassination, and the filling of the ranks of foreign legions. The U.S. has maintained this stance toward at least the American people that American troops and American weapons were not being used to attack targets in Russia. And to that extent, we were not actually at war. And because of those small technicalities, standard issue villagers on the uniparty right and the uniparty left comforted themselves. None of this is that serious. It's not a threat to us. We got to fight them over there, so we don't fight them over here. Of course, we will defeat Russia, so we must keep pushing forward. Nothing bad is going to happen. We're not even at war with Russia. So despite everything I mentioned more, and I actually forgot to mention the sanctions that were applied, the economic war the United States waged against the people of Russia. But despite all of that, we were not actually at war with Russia in the mind of the American child brain, because we weren't attacking targets in Russia with American troops or American weapons. So a couple weeks ago, it came as an element of obvious narrative escalation that we were being told, the child brains, the standard issue villagers on all sides were being told, hey, remember how we told you we weren't at war with Russia? Well, we're still not totally at war with Russia, but it's okay if you feel a little bit more like we are. And with that, the saber rattling began. This is Reuters. U.S. President Joe Biden approved Ukraine using U.S. weapons to strike targets inside Russia that were attacking the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv after Kyiv sought authorization from Washington in recent weeks. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed on Friday. So Ukraine has been seeking approval, authorization from the very real President Joe Biden to use the weapons the U.S. gave to Ukraine to strike targets in Russia. And finally, after the situation in Ukraine growing worse over those weeks, the fake president's administration agreed to those requests. We're going to do everything we can for you, Volodymyr, you comedic actor, you. Sure, it's been weeks since your presidential term officially ended, but yeah, you're still there because of martial law. You had to cancel those elections. We are helping you to save democracy in Ukraine. Therefore, the last thing we can afford right now is elections. So the comedic actor in Ukraine has extended his term after declaring martial law and banning opposition political parties. And now the fake president has determined that the comedic actor can use U.S. weapons to strike targets inside Russia to save democracy in a war that Ukraine has absolutely no hope of winning. Okay. Speaking at a news conference in Prague after an informal meeting of NATO foreign ministers, Blinken did not specifically say whether Biden's authorization could expand to include other Russian cities and targets that are deeper inside Russia. He said Washington's move, a marked change in policy by Biden, who had steadfastly refused to allow Ukraine to use American weaponry for strikes inside Russia, was a result of U.S. strategy adjusting and adapting to the background. Now, he said, the U.S. is responding to what it has seen in and around the Kharkiv region. Over the past few weeks, Ukraine came to us and asked for the authorization to use weapons that we are providing to defend against this aggression, including against Russian forces that are massing on the Russian side of the border and then attacking into Ukraine, Blinken said. And that went right to the president. And as you've heard, he's approved use of our weapons for that purpose. Going forward, we'll continue to do what we've been doing, which is, as necessary, adapt and adjust, Blinken said. The article notes that Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, is just 19 miles from the border with Russia to the north. But to the east, that region shares a border with Donetsk and Lugansk, which are both now just part of Russia. Now, often when you see an article like this that says, okay, now we've agreed that something can happen. We weren't going to allow this thing before, but now we agree that it can happen. Chances are that thing has already happened. And rather than reporting that event as shocking news that can be framed as something happening beyond their control or knowledge or approval, they'll first submit a round of these stories so that a public argument and a public debate can occur on whether or not it's smart that Biden is now allowing U.S. weapons to be used in Russia. It confirms the prior narrative that U.S. weapons up till that point had not been used to strike targets in Russia, and therefore we weren't really at war. And it'll make it seem, by the time reports of the weapons use come around, that the pro arguments had defeated the anti arguments. or that at least it didn't matter and we're just going to have to be okay with it. And so naturally, a few days later, we get the payoff. This is the New York Times on June 4th. Ukraine strikes into Russia with Western weapons, official says. Just days after the Biden administration granted permission for Ukraine to fire American weapons into Russia, Kyiv took advantage of its new latitude, striking a military facility over the border using a U.S.-made artillery system, according to a member of Ukraine's parliament. Yehor Chernev, the deputy chairman of the Ukrainian Parliament's Committee on National Security, Defense, and Intelligence, said on Tuesday that Ukrainian forces had destroyed Russian missile launchers with a strike in the Belgorod region, about 20 miles into Russia. Ukraine's forces used a high-mobility artillery rocket system, or HIMARS, he said. It was the first time a Ukrainian official has acknowledged publicly that Ukraine had used American weapons to fire into Russia since President Biden lifted the ban on such strikes. So a very specific factual claim there that serves to support the narrative that nothing like this had ever happened prior to the fake president giving his approval. But that's not actually what they said. They said this is the first time a Ukrainian official has publicly acknowledged that scenario occurred. For months, the ban has stood as a red line the Biden administration would not cross out of concern about increasing tensions with a nuclear-armed nation. Now, let's leave aside the conversation about any actual nuclear threat and just focus on the narrative here. We are being told that the fake president was concerned about escalating to the point of a nuclear standoff, but now, after 2.5 years of never doing anything in Ukraine, but losing all the time, we're being told that for some reason, it's now worth it. And to recap, we had sharing intelligence, arming, funding, targeting for assassinations, filling foreign legions, and waging economic warfare, not to mention the global propaganda campaign. And now we are not even hiding using American weapons inside Russia, and we are still supposed to imagine that we are not at war with Russia. If they were to tell us at some point that we were at war with Russia, what would have to change in order to substantiate that? The answer is obviously nothing. Therefore, the only conclusion to draw is that, at least in a narrative sense, we are already at war with Russia. What we are told substantiates the claim that we are at war with Russia, insofar as any of this is represented in reality prime. This particular narrative move just makes sure that the volume is not turned up all the way on us being at war with Russia, which of course obscures the situation. But the point is that it leaves so much space for the volume to still be turned up, which means that the fear that can be produced can continue to be escalated, which means more compliance, more concessions can be extracted from the people in public sentiment. Back to the Times. In granting permission last week, the United States imposed limitations, saying the weapons could only be used in Russian territory near northeastern Ukraine and for defensive purposes. Mr. Chernev, in text messages, said Ukraine destroyed S-300 and S-400 missile systems without specifying how many. Russia has used the systems, initially designed to shoot down aircraft, to bombard the northeastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, which is just 45 miles from Belgorod. Mr. Chernev's account of the strike could not be independently confirmed, but videos of the aftermath of the attack on the S-300 and S-400 systems emerged on Monday. Satellite imagery and social media posts suggest there were multiple strikes in Russian territory over the weekend. Mr. Chernev, a former member of the Ukrainian military, is also the head of Ukraine's delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, a role which has led him to take part in discussions with Western partners about the supply and use of Western weapons. The Times quotes an expert with the Foreign Policy Research Institute who believes that these attacks must have been done with HIMARS. Russian bloggers, researchers analyzing satellite images and footage of the battlefields, and the Russian Defense Ministry have reported multiple instances of strikes inside Russia with American rockets since Thursday. And again, this would be the Thursday before last, when the Biden administration approved their use. So Biden says it's okay if the Ukrainians do this, and as soon as he says it, wow, the Ukrainians have done it. For weeks, Ukraine had been aggressively lobbying its Western allies to allow it to use their weapons to strike inside Russia. It said that Russian troops were massing at the border and preparing strikes on Ukraine with impunity. And it cited the urgency of being able to hit airplanes that drop so-called glide bombs from inside Russian territory that soar to targets in Ukraine, as well as striking military bases, command points, and ammunition depots in Russia. It sounds like the narratives that were coming out around the beginning of the war. Do you remember how there was that whole narrative push to close the sky? Hashtag close the sky? It was like Adam Kinzinger and Dan Crenshaw and various other clowns. They wanted a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and by Ukraine they meant the eastern portion of Ukraine, which is now all just Russia. Of course, if anyone invades that no-fly zone, you can shoot them down, and if you shoot them down, then they can shoot you down, and then we're in an all-out war. It was almost like that's what they wanted back then. It's strange that they're attempting to escalate to that same point right now, 2.5 years later, having accomplished nothing since then. The comedic actor last Tuesday on Telegram posted, "We use every meeting and every day to give our warriors more possibilities. I am grateful to all partners who are helping in the way we need it and in time." Skipping ahead. Russia has repeatedly warned Ukraine's Western allies that allowing strikes inside Russia would carry grave consequences. "We would like to warn U.S. officials against miscalculations that may have fatal consequences," a Russian deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, said on Monday. For some unclear reasons, they underestimate the seriousness of the response they may get. Russia has not specified what those consequences would be, though Putin last week made a veiled threat against small European countries, noting that they are, quote, very densely populated. A spokesman for the National Security Council, John Kirby, said the United States will not reconsider its policy prohibiting strikes deeper in Russia in the nearest weeks. The administration also prohibited Ukraine from firing a longer-range, more powerful rocket, ATACMS, into Russia. Ukrainian officials are pushing for expanded permissions to fire into Russia. So the fake president decided it was okay for Ukraine to attack Russia inside Russia, but not that far inside Russia and not that hard. Because, of course, all of this is still being framed as Ukraine acting in self-defense. Attacking inside Russia using American weapons is a practical necessity. The Times article ends quoting a Ukrainian military analyst who says all Russian troops at the border region must be destroyed to not let them break through. There are official positions of Ukraine and the United States. All the rest is the fog of war. The Associated Press continued their coverage the next day in an article with the headline, "Ukraine uses U.S. weapons to strike inside Russia," according to a senator and a Western official. So still not independently confirmed, but some people have said that this is what's happening, and the media says we must believe it. Ukraine has used U.S. weapons to strike inside Russia in recent days, according to a U.S. senator and a Western official familiar with the matter. The weapons were used under recently approved guidance from President Joe Biden, allowing American arms to be used to hit targets inside Russia for the limited purpose of defending Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. So again, we're fighting them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. And also over there, they're fighting them over there so we don't have to fight them here being in Ukraine. So they're attacking Russia in Russia so they don't have to fight them in Ukraine. And it's not a war because we haven't said war yet. In fact, it's everything but war. The official was not authorized to comment publicly on the sensitive matter and spoke on condition of anonymity. Republican Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, confirmed the strikes with U.S. weapons, but did not say how he was briefed. On Tuesday, White House National Security spokesman John Kirby told reporters he could not confirm that Ukraine had used U.S. weapons against targets in Russia. We're just not in a position on a day-to-day basis of knowing exactly what the Ukrainians are firing at what, Kirby said. It's certainly at a tactical level. So a Ukrainian official, an anonymous official, some social media accounts, and Republican Senator from South Dakota Mike Rounds say that Ukraine is using American weapons to attack Russia inside Russian territory, and the White House spokesman for the fake president doesn't know whether or not that's true, or at least can't tell us. The Associated Press notes that confirmation of the strikes comes as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Qatar, which along with Saudi Arabia and the UAE has been a mediator in prisoner swaps and other negotiations between Russia and Ukraine since the war began. Qatari state media says that the discussion revolved around ways, quote, to stop the fighting, protect civilians, and keep all channels of communication open to resolve the crisis through dialogue and diplomatic means. The fake president was over in France last week to embarrass the United States on the world stage in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and he had this to mumble to ABC's David Muir.
I know for years you've resisted the idea of American weapons being used for any sort of direct strike inside Russia, but we did witness this shift in recent days, authorizing American weapons for limited direct strikes. Are American weapons being used right now inside Russia?
They're authorized to be used in proximity to the border. We're not authorizing strikes 200 miles into Russia. We're not authorizing strikes on Moscow, on the Kremlin.
So the interviewer essentially has to lay out the official story. These are all the essential elements of this narrative so that Joe Biden won't have to remember any of them. He can simply say, yes, that's right, and then add his own little flavor to make it seem like he's in control of the situation. And that's exactly what they have there. Biden said, yes, they're approved, but not to strike too far inside Russia, just to strike around the border. It's not like we're trying to go to war with Russia. It's not like we're trying to escalate all the way. We still have to have room to maneuver because it's not time for the big Russian nuclear scare event yet. We're not trying to marry this war, but a little groping and sniffing never hurt anybody. Now, it's worth noting that the media is no longer being nice to Joe Biden. They are not generally protecting Joe Biden, except relative to Donald Trump. They want the public to generally understand that Biden can't get the job done. You need to let go of Biden, whatever your emotional attachment or intellectual attachment to Joe Biden is. You need to kind of just back away from that because we might switch him out. In fact, we kind of have to switch him out. And we're going to want everyone to agree. We're going to want to know that everyone is on board with whoever we put in there. Joe Biden, we're told, just escalated tensions with a nuclear-armed power, something he's been avoiding for years, and he can barely mumble out an explanation of what's actually happening over there. He makes a fool of himself on the world stage. He is regularly portrayed as tired and incompetent. And if we get to the point of a narrative about a full-blown war with Russia, Joe Biden can be blamed for the escalation just as he's being blamed for absolutely everything else. And the regime doesn't have to care about that because Joe Biden will no longer be their critical, protected representative, the person whose image they have to keep squeaky clean. In fact, it'll only benefit them to have Joe Biden as a fall guy. The reality, or the reality they'll present to us, will already be baked into the cake. There's nothing you can do to prevent what's already happened. Yes, it's sad that we're at war. It's sad that Joe Biden escalated us into this war, but now we are at war and Joe Biden's gone. He's not the issue any longer. So I guess what we're going to have to do is just commit to destroying Russia. And if you want to blame it on Biden, well, okay. We should expect to see this process across the board. From the Russian side, last Tuesday, we had this report from Politico in Europe, Politico.eu. Moscow ready to strike French military trainers in Ukraine. Russia responded with a new threat of escalation on Tuesday to reports that France could soon send trainers to help the Ukrainian military. No instructor involved in training the Ukrainian military has immunity. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told the press, according to a report from French newswire AFP. It doesn't matter whether they're French or not, Peskov added. Last week, Ukraine's top commander, Alexander Syrskyi, said French trainers would come to Ukraine, quote unquote, soon. A statement which was downplayed at the time in both Paris and Kyiv. French President Emmanuel Macron, who will meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky this week during the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in France, could soon announce a small coalition of countries willing to send trainers on the ground to Ukraine. There is no consensus on officially sending, taking on, and endorsing ground troops, but in a dynamic situation, nothing should be ruled out, Macron said in February. Russia's Vladimir Putin said last week there were already, quote, specialists in Ukraine under the guise of mercenaries, end quote. And that's been consistently true for well over 2 years now. Maria Zakharova from the Russian Foreign Ministry said that Moscow had, quote, confirmation coming in on reports that France is preparing to send its troops to Ukraine. And that was, of course, in reference to these, quote unquote, trainers. Let's go to this headline from the Associated Press on June 6th. Putin warns that Russia could provide long-range weapons to others to strike Western targets. And this, of course, in direct response to the U.S. and NATO allies giving their approval for Ukraine to use Western arms to attack Russia inside Russian territory. Putin also reaffirmed Moscow's readiness to use nuclear weapons if it sees a threat to its sovereignty. And again, Putin has consistently called these bluffs for the last 2.5 years. The media will then report any of these comments as though Putin and Russia are responsible for the escalation. The recent actions by the West will further undermine international security and could lead to, quote, very serious problems, Putin said, taking questions from international journalists, something that has become extremely rare since Moscow sent troops into Ukraine. Ah, yes, Putin is the one we never hear from. Joe Biden is always the one clearly, confidently, competently telling us exactly what's going on and exactly what to expect. That would mark their direct involvement in the war against the Russian Federation, and we reserve the right to act the same way, Putin added. The United States and Germany recently authorized Ukraine to hit some targets on Russian soil with the long-range weapons they are supplying to Kyiv. Putin claimed that using some Western-supplied weapons involves military personnel of those countries controlling the missiles and selecting targets. And therefore, he said, Moscow could take asymmetrical steps elsewhere in the world. The U.S. military said it does not control the missiles it provides to Ukraine or the targets. But again, there's been extensive reporting from mainstream outlets about everything I said before. The funding, the arming, the filling of personnel in foreign legions, the sharing of intelligence, the targeting of Russian military officials for assassinations, various terrorist attacks on infrastructure, various terrorist attacks inside Russia, CIA training of Ukrainian battalions and special operations units, and of course the economic warfare waged. But the claim from the U.S., the claim from the West is basically nuh-uh. If they consider it possible to deliver such weapons to the combat zone, to launch strikes on our territory and create problems for us, why don't we have the right to supply weapons of the same type to some regions of the world where they can be used to launch strikes on sensitive facilities of the countries that do it to Russia, he said. We will think about it, he told journalists on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Asked whether Russia could resort to using nuclear arms, Putin said the conditions for utilizing that arsenal are clearly spelled out in Moscow's security doctrine. For some reason, they believe in the West that Russia will never use it, he said. Look at what is written there, he said of Russia's nuclear doctrine. If somebody's actions threaten our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we consider it possible to use all means at our disposal. Even Russia's battlefield nuclear weapons are much more powerful than what the U.S. used against Japan in World War II, Putin said. And legitimately, any nuclear weapon would automatically be more powerful than those nuclear weapons, since those nuclear weapons were just conventional weapons in all likelihood. So the fake president says it's okay that American weapons are used by Ukraine to strike targets inside Russia, but not that far inside Russia. He had resisted that sort of escalation for months, if not years, and finally, Zelensky just made the request enough times and finally Joe Biden folded. Sure, this could instigate kinetic warfare with one of our most powerful adversaries. But the Ukrainians have been very patient, and we did tell this president whose term has expired that we would do everything we could to save democracy in Ukraine, even after he declared martial law and canceled the elections. And in response, Putin let the world know that Western troops and assets inside Ukraine would be considered fair targets for Russians, and the same would apply to targets inside Western nations. And in fact, if the U.S. was going to allow their weapons to be used by Ukraine to attack Russia, then Russia should allow their weapons to be used to attack various Western countries being launched from third-party nations in the vicinity of those countries. Andrei Kartopolov from the Duma's Defense Committee has also said that F-16 fighter jets and any airfields they are based at will be legitimate targets for the Russian military if they participate in combat missions against Moscow's forces. So if these jets that are sent over to help defend Ukraine's very legitimate democracy are used against Russia's forces, then they will become fair targets too, as will whatever airfields they're launched from. By the end of the week, as most of the world had been at least reasonably convinced that the leader of the free world, or so they're told, crapped his pants on stage, his position in the world and therefore the standing of the American president was so diminished that we got to this point. This is CBS from Friday. Biden apologizes to Ukrainian President Zelensky for holdup on military aid. Quote, "We're still in." President Biden on Friday, for the first time, publicly apologized to Ukraine for a months-long holdup in American military assistance that let Russia make gains on the battlefield, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed for unipartisan U.S. support, quote, "like it was during World War II," end quote. Speaking in Paris a day after they attended 80th anniversary events of D-Day in Normandy, Mr. Biden apologized to the Ukrainian people for weeks of not knowing if more assistance would come while conservative Republicans in Congress held up a $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine for 6 months. You haven't bowed down. You haven't yielded at all, Mr. Biden told his Ukrainian counterpart. You continue to fight in a way that is just remarkable, just remarkable. We're not going to walk away from you. The president insisted that the American people were standing by Ukraine for the long haul, saying we're still in completely, thoroughly. You are the bulwark against the aggression that's taking place, Mr. Biden said of Zelensky. So the fake president suggests that the American people are still somehow standing with Ukraine. Sure, they've taken their Ukraine flags down from their houses and they've removed their Ukraine flag emojis from their social media accounts. Both of those things they did because it's become too embarrassing to still publicly stand with Ukraine. But sure, they all still do it. The comedic actor responded by saying it's very important that in this unity, United States of America, all American people, stay with Ukraine like it was during World War II. How the United States helped to save human lives, to save Europe. And we count on your continuing support in standing with us, shoulder to shoulder. And it could certainly be argued that the United States did stand shoulder to shoulder with Volodymyr Zelensky's benefactors and the global regime behind him. And that is no slight whatsoever to the brave American men who went over there under the understanding that they were defending their country and indeed the free world. But so many years later, we should at least be able to understand that we weren't exactly told the truth about what happened throughout that era. Further along in the article, Mr. Biden and Mr. Zelensky attended the anniversary events of D-Day in Normandy, northern France, on Thursday, along with European leaders who have supported Kyiv's efforts in the war. Biden pledged, quote, "We will not walk away," end quote, from Ukraine, drawing a direct line from the fight to liberate Europe from Nazi domination to today's war against Russian aggression. Ukraine depicts its fight against the Kremlin's forces as a clash between Western democratic freedom and Russian tyranny. Russia says it is defending itself against a menacing eastward expansion of the NATO military alliance. And that is irrefutably true. NATO has advanced toward the east over the course of decades. It's not like Western powers deny that fact. They just say they were forced into doing it because the threat from Russia was so real. In a 20-minute speech on Friday at the National Assembly, the lower house of the French Parliament, Zelensky drew a parallel with the sacrifices made during World War II and his country's current fight. This battle is a crossroads, Zelensky said, a moment where we can now write history in the way we need it, or we can become victims of history as it suits our enemy. Ah, yes, the opportunity to write history the way we need it. Last week, the head of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, spoke at the U.S. Army War College. He gave a long speech and took questions and presented a confident face of the NATO effort in Ukraine. He said during his remarks, "The two most poignant questions I often get asked are, one, how much longer will the war in Ukraine take? And two, when will the Russians attack us?" With regard to the first, I will defer to President Zelensky, who said at the Munich Security Summit, "Ask not how much longer the war in Ukraine will take. Ask yourself why Putin is still able to sustain it." There is heavy fighting going on the battlefield. The delays in support have had real consequences. But with the recent pledges and the ability to use certain weapons to strike inside Russian territory, to shoot the archer, so to say, I am confident that Ukraine can prevail. He added that the Russians have no idea what they're fighting for, and morale continues to be low. He said, if Ukraine loses this war, it will not be the end of instability. It will be the start of much more instability, because autocratic leaders worldwide will learn a chilling lesson that brute force will not only be accepted, but indeed rewarded. In many ways, this war is not only about democracy versus autocracy. It is very much also about accountability versus impunity. And it is up to all of us to make sure that the force of law prevails. And you have to think that right there, he's talking about international law, a nonsensical concept that can't actually mean anything more than might makes right. He is asserting the necessity of some enforcement mechanism that can be used against any country that dissents from the one world, international, liberal, rules-based order. Bauer says that brings me to the second question I often get asked. When will the Russians attack us? Well, I have to say that depends to a large extent on us. NATO allies represent 50% of the world's economic power and 50% of the world's military power. We have it within ourselves to strengthen the strongest alliance in the world, to ramp up our deterrence, and to make sure any adversary thinks 10 times before they attempt something. But in order to do that, we need not only a whole of government, but a whole of society approach. So essentially, they need to bring to bear all of the power of their economic and military alliance. Everyone has to do absolutely everything because it's an existential crisis. He concluded the speech saying, "The fact that we reacted as fast as we did after the large-scale invasion is because we had the military capabilities and the political will to act fast and united. NATO remains the only organization in the world where on a daily basis the political level and the military level comes together and finds consensus on thousands of pieces of policy. The fact that we are able to do that with 32 countries is nothing short of remarkable. Yeah, I would agree. That almost suggests there's some sort of higher organizing authority that makes it so the countries don't even have to negotiate and agree. They just have to go along with the plan and do what they're told. He says, and even though the world is facing unprecedented levels of conflict and tensions, there is amongst allies still an unwavering belief that democracy can triumph over tyranny, that freedom can triumph over oppression, and that light can triumph over darkness. I wonder if Joe Biden wrote him this speech. In the years that are to come, NATO will continue to do what it does best: unite, adapt, and protect. The integration of NATO and national military planning will enable us to do exactly what the NATO flag symbolizes. The allies will follow the same compass. Very bold, very brave. Russia does not stand a chance against NATO, so long as NATO can actually amass all that power, all those economic resources they claim to have, and direct them in the way Bauer claims they're able to direct them, in actually thwarting the Russian threat. Now, they haven't been able to do that for 2.5 years, and the alliance doesn't seem stronger. In fact, it seems far weaker. But Rob Bauer, before the Army War College, seems to be very confident that it's going to happen nonetheless. Except he also recently said this.
Then there is the discussion on what the next target might be, whether it is in NATO or outside NATO. But the Russians are basically everywhere. They are in space, they are in cyber, they are in Africa, where they use the Africa Corps, the former Wagner Group, to destabilize nations. They are in the Arctic. They are in the Atlantic Ocean. So they are everywhere, trying to create strategic dilemmas for the alliance, and if there's other opponents. And so that is something we will be vigilant on. We have to make sure that we keep on looking 360 degrees in all domains: space, cyber, land, maritime, air.
So Russia is everywhere, geographically everywhere, presenting threats to the alliance. And this accounts for land, air, maritime, the sea, and space/cyber, because that's what's meant when they're talking about space. It's not X-Wings and TIE fighters defending the Death Star and bouncing from planet to planet. And last week, we were presented with a threat about exactly where Russia is, or might be later on. As my good friend Burning Bright pointed out last week, this report seems to be planting seeds for the future. This is June 6th, CBS News again. Russian warships to arrive in Havana next week, say Cuban officials, as military exercises expected. 4 Russian warships, including a nuclear-powered submarine, will arrive in Havana next week, Cuban officials said Thursday. That's this week, by the way, citing historically friendly relations between both nations. And as tensions escalate over Western military support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. Cuba's foreign ministry said in a news release that the ships will be in Havana between June 12th and June 17th, noting that none of them will carry any nuclear weapons and assuring their presence, quote, does not represent a threat to the region. The announcement came a day after U.S. officials said that Washington had been tracking Russian warships and aircraft that were expected to arrive in the Caribbean for a military exercise. They said the exercise would be part of a broader Russian response to the U.S. support for Ukraine. Those exercises will likely include Russian long-range bombers flying along the U.S. East Coast, according to CBS News national security correspondent David Martin. Russian warships have made port calls in Cuba before, and warplanes have flown along the East Coast in the past as well. But this will be the first time in 5 years both will happen at the same time, Martin said. U.S. officials said that the Russian military presence was notable but not concerning. However, it's taking place as Russian President Vladimir Putin has suggested that Moscow could take asymmetrical steps elsewhere in the world in response to President Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike inside Russia to protect Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. Martin noted the presence of 4 warships in Cuba, quote, pales in comparison to the size of the exercises the U.S. military has been conducting with its NATO allies in Europe. So this is not considered in any way a direct threat to the United States, end quote. Still, the U.S. military will be tracking the exercises very closely. While U.S. presence in the Caribbean is currently very light, the presence of military bases all along the East Coast and Gulf Coast means the U.S. could send ships and aircraft to the area quickly if necessary, Martin said. CBS followed up today. Russian military exercises in the Caribbean. Here's what to expect. They quote, once again, John Kirby, the fake administration's national security spokesman, who says we have no indication and no expectation that nuclear weapons will be at play here in these exercises or embarked on those vessels. But thank goodness the media continues to ask whether or not it's a possibility so that we can pretend that very remote possibility is actually a grave threat. You know, just in case we need to turn the volume up on the scare factor. The ship's arrival in Havana, which the Cuban Foreign Ministry said is expected to include the fanfare of one Russian ship firing 21 salvos in a salute to Cuba, comes ahead of Russia carrying out air and naval exercises in the Caribbean in the coming weeks, a different U.S. official told Martin. The exercises, which will include long-range bombers, will be the first simultaneous air and naval maneuvers Russia has carried out in the Caribbean since 2019, the U.S. official said. The exercises will be conducted over the summer, culminating in a worldwide naval exercise in the fall, and that will present all sorts of narrative opportunities. Clearly, this is them signaling their displeasure about what we're doing for Ukraine. This is Kirby again. So we're going to watch it. We're going to monitor it. It's not unexpected. But we don't anticipate, we don't expect that there will be any imminent threat or any threat at all, quite frankly, to American national security in the region, in the Caribbean region, or anywhere else. And that, of course, is because we're definitely, absolutely not at war with Russia. Sure, we're doing everything but war, but it's not war. War, you see, would include all of these things we're doing and also the authoritative source admitting that we are at war. And because that's the case, the only real determinative factor in whether or not we are at war is whether or not the authoritative source says we're at war. So you can basically scrap all the other things. We are only at war if the authoritative source says we're at war. The reality on the ground does not matter. There does not need to be a single verifiable fact in reality prime for the authoritative source to suggest we are at war. They simply say that we are, and that's it. We can do everything but admit that we are at war, and we are not at war until such time as the authoritative source says we are. Once again, the narrative is what matters above absolutely all else. And about that narrative seeding I mentioned a moment ago, the last section of this article is 3 sentences long with the heading, "What was the Cuban Missile Crisis?" The events in the Caribbean are different from the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened over 60 years ago. The 1962 crisis unfolded after the U.S. discovered launch sites in Cuba for Soviet ballistic nuclear missiles. Over the course of 13 days, the crisis brought the Soviet Union and the U.S. dangerously close to nuclear war. A potential conflict was averted when the Kennedy administration reached a deal with the Kremlin for the missiles to be removed from Cuba. And that is absolutely all that happened. Crisis averted. We're definitely not going to get a rerun of the Cuban Missile Crisis so that we can all pick it apart and understand that we've been fooled once again. And let's add one last wrinkle to the escalation. This is from yesterday in Reuters. Biden, France's Macron, reach agreement on using Russian assets for Ukraine. This is especially interesting considering that the public narrative yesterday in the EU parliamentary elections was that leaders like Macron had been substantially weakened. Fake President Joe Biden said on Sunday he had reached an agreement with French President Emmanuel Macron on the use of profits from frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. Asked if the two men had discussed the issue and whether they had come up with an agreement, Biden replied yes and yes. The Group of Seven Nations and the European Union are considering how to use profits generated by Russian assets immobilized in the West to provide Ukraine with a large upfront loan now and secure Kyiv's financing for 2025. Around 260 billion euros, about $281 billion of Russian central bank funds are frozen worldwide, most of it in the EU. The funds generate 2.5 to 3.5 billion euros a year in profit, which the EU says is not contractually owed to Russia and therefore represents a windfall. So they're able to steal it. They're saying we're allowed to steal this Russian money. The idea championed by the U.S. is to use this profit as a steady revenue stream to service a large loan of $50 billion that could be raised on the market. Russia says any diversion of the profits from its frozen funds would amount to theft. Tapping profits from Russian assets has drawn concerns from some countries, but a U.S. Treasury official on Tuesday said that the U.S. and its G7 partners were making progress. Again, this is something we've discussed many times, the Repo Act, as it's been called. This is over the course of years now, by the way, that they've been working on this. This is going to have major effects on the reputation of the global West's role in global financing, could further diminish the status of the American dollar as the global reserve currency. And Vladimir Putin pressed that point at the SPIEF conference that was held at the end of last week and over the weekend. At one point, he had this to say: "There is no other guarantee except for the trust in the American economy in today's global financial system. And of course, the United States is exploiting its monopoly position in the global financial market. They are making serious money on this exploitation. According to the data that is publicly available, the United States has allegedly borrowed $54.3 trillion from the global economy. There is no guarantee in the global financial system except the trust in the American economy. While we're adding $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, and the American dollar is fading away as the global reserve currency. And if Putin is correct, our debt sounds far greater than the $35 trillion we believe it to be." And so let's talk about SPIEF, the bizarro world WEF. And as I was looking into this yesterday, I found an interesting headline from last year's coverage in the New York Times. "The war is an afterthought at the St. Petersburg Forum, once a marquee event for Putin." So this is June 14th of last year. The annual International Economic Forum opening in the Russian city of St. Petersburg on Wednesday has long been the country's premier event for attracting Western investors. And at first glance, the agenda this year seems to indicate that the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine changed little. Planned panel topics include Russia as a global tech hub and the Arctic, territory of investment opportunities and vivid travel. While the word war never appears, even if euphemisms crop up repeatedly, such as the quote-unquote evolving circumstances or the quote-unquote military political crisis in Europe. The real clue that the war and its accompanying Western economic sanctions have transformed the state-run SPIEF into a shadow of its former self is the scant international presence. Significant trading partners like China and India are dispatching representatives, as are a small number of other Asian, Middle Eastern, African, and Latin American friends. Yet the world, for the most part, and the Western world in particular, is staying away. And consider the inversion at work in this presentation, in this framing. This conference used to be Russia's premier event to attract Western investment and Western money. That means globalist money, regime money. The New York Times is telling us that the regime is no longer coming to Russia, no longer intending to invest in regime-oriented projects in Russia. And again, when the regime is trying to take over nations, trying to infiltrate governments, subsume those nations into the one world international liberal rules-based order, what they do is flood investment money into those countries. They fund whatever politicians and political agenda items are necessary to do business, and then they bring their transnational corporations into these countries in order to transform them. This is how a nation becomes part of our democracy. So that money is no longer flowing into Russia. And somehow, at this economic forum, Russia's barely even mentioning the war in Ukraine. They're treating it as though it's not even happening at all. I mean, we're being told that it's definitely happening. In fact, it's escalating. And of course, the entire world is on our side and on the side of the West. It's only these small, rogue nations and a handful of autocracies, our vicious adversaries, that would ever attend this Russian forum where they're not even discussing Putin's very brutal invasion. They're all disrespecting Vladimir Putin. The article notes, long gone are the days when President Emmanuel Macron of France showed up with Mr. Putin, or when Russian oligarchs sponsored parties on the sidelines with free-flowing champagne and leggy models where executives from top Western oil companies hobnobbed with ministers. We are supposed to understand that this makes the event less glamorous, which also, I guess, must mean less serious. They're not all getting drunk with a bunch of models at SPIEF 2023. And all the Western investors have backed out. Russia and its economy must have their backs up against the wall. Various media outlets are pushing the same narrative this year, despite the fact that there's about 140 countries with representatives in attendance at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The event is only sparsely attended by the international community if you ignore everyone but the members of the quote-unquote global West. Here's the headline from Friday in CNBC. Consider how similar this is to the narrative handling of last year's conference. War? What war? Putin looks to woo new business partners willing to overlook its invasion of Ukraine. Now, that headline is barely literate, but what should we expect? Russia's annual economic forum in St. Petersburg used to be known as the country's Davos, in a nod to the World Economic Forum that's held in Switzerland every year. War in Ukraine has changed the dial in global geopolitical and trade relations, however. The days when scores of Western business leaders and heads of state attended the SPIEF, an event that enables Russia to showcase its economy and investment opportunities, are long gone. Now Russia is looking to use SPIEF to court new relationships with countries apparently less squeamish about doing business with a country that has invaded its neighbor, namely a number of nations in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and those willing to turn a blind eye to the war for their own economic interests, such as Russia's oil and gas customers in Eastern Europe, Slovakia, and Hungary. A fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute named Max Hess told CNBC, they trumpet and highlight international attendees and domestic propaganda extremely, but except for a few of the usual characters like the Hungarian foreign minister, nobody new and notable is showing up, and also no new major investments or deals will be agreed at this forum, at least not with major foreign countries. So again, because the global powers of the quote-unquote West are not there and are not participating, nothing is happening. And it's worth noting that this is the global propaganda media's normal viewpoint. If you ignore the multipolar world order as it emerges, then everyone will simply act as though nothing's changed, which means the way forward is to do what we're told like we've always done before. Hang flags on our house when we're told to hang flags, change our social media emojis when everyone else is doing it, give money when we're told to give money, give support when we're told to give support, be scared when we're told to be scared. We are not at war. There's no reason to object. Sure, we're doing everything but war, but until the authoritative source admits we're at war, there's more scaring to be done. Spieth has been blacklisted by most Western businesses and politicians since February 24, 2022, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine. But Russia is keen to show it's open to business from elsewhere, and indeed, its need and desire for economic partnerships with non-Western nations have accompanied heightened anti-Western sentiment and rhetoric in the last few years. Moscow claims that it wants to combat Western hegemony and to establish a multipolar world order, and has promoted trading partnerships excluding the West as a way to do this. On that note, the theme for this year's conference is the foundations of a multipolar world, the formation of new areas of growth. This article was written before Putin's speech, but they noted in a preview of Putin's address, it's uncertain how much the war in Ukraine, or quote-unquote special military operation, will feature in his address. However, with Moscow likely to want to skirt over the conflict as it looks to attract investment. So again, Russia's just going to pretend that the war, the special military operation, isn't even happening. What a strange thing to be pretending alongside another 136 to 140 other countries, especially with nuclear war closer than it's ever been before. Back to the article. What's galling for Western nations is that Russia has indeed managed to adapt its economy to a new reality of sanctions and trade restrictions on some of its biggest industries, such as the oil and gas sector. Russia's economy is expected to grow faster than all advanced economies this year, the International Monetary Fund predicted in April. So Russia's economy is growing faster than all of the advanced economies, despite not having any of the Western nations involved in their conference and the Western investment money not flowing into Russia. That's not supposed to be possible, right? What has happened to our standing on the world stage? Let's skip down toward the end. Analysts will be keeping an eye on any announcements regarding the BRICS organization, the group of economies comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And since January, new members such as Ethiopia, Iran, and Egypt, with Turkey mooting the possibility of joining the bloc. Opportunities for economic partnerships between BRICS nations feature heavily in this year's Spieth. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov welcomed Ankara's interest in joining the group, he said Tuesday, saying the subject would be on the agenda of the next BRICS summit. The analyst mentioned before, Hess from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, said, "Will Putin actually get anything meaningful for what he wants? No. Maybe the Kabuki Theater will go on and Turkey will hold some more talks about BRICS membership. But as we saw with the January announcement of the expansion of that organization, it's an entire and complete nothing burger." Yeah, this does sound like a nothing burger, for sure. They've got Russia right where they want them. But then there's this. From the Turkish Anadolu Agency, BRICS meeting starts in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod. A two-day meeting of foreign ministers belonging to the BRICS bloc of emerging economies commenced on Monday in the Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod. The meeting marks the first gathering since the group expanded from 5 members to 9 in January, with the addition of Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE as official members. Another 15 countries, including Turkey, were also invited to the expanded format of the meeting. The meeting began with a moment of silence for Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister Hussein Amir Abdollahian, who were killed in that helicopter crash, or so we're told. Recent international events have taken off the masks of those in the West who until now had verbally claimed almost the exclusive right to define so-called universal values under the guise of a rules-based order, said Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. arguing that those supporting this idea are trying to impose norms and mechanisms only beneficial to them. Lavrov said that the U.S. and its allies are trying to preserve their dominance and slow down the formation of multipolarity. They use economic instruments as weapons through sanctions pressure and financial blackmail, try to influence the choice of development models and trading partners by sovereign states, he added. He said active work is being done to implement the decisions made at the BRICS Johannesburg summit last year, indicating the measures particularly focus on developing a platform for transactions in national currencies. So again, we're seeing the decentralized alternative to what has throughout our lifetimes and much longer been a centralized global financial system, with countries moving away from the American dollar, particularly when it comes to energy resources. And so let's bring this home by returning to the subject of Russia-Ukraine. This is the Financial Times today. Ukraine's top reconstruction official quits in new blow for Zelensky. The top Ukrainian official overseeing wartime reconstruction and defense fortifications has resigned, claiming his agency was being systematically undermined by the government. Mustafa Naim's departure is the latest in a series of personnel changes in Kyiv that have shaken the confidence of Western partners in President Volodymyr Zelensky's government and irked some of Ukraine's own officials. So Western partners means the power players within the global regime, the sorts of countries that are protesting Putin's very brutal invasion by not attending the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Naim, head of the State Agency for Restoration and Infrastructure Development, told the Financial Times that Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal had barred him from participating in the annual Ukraine Recovery Conference on June 11th and 12th in Berlin, where donors will meet to support projects for rebuilding cities and infrastructure destroyed by Russia's full-scale invasion. So the partners skipped the SPIEF, and instead they were supposed to meet to plan ways to rebuild Ukraine, and the man responsible for rebuilding Ukraine was not allowed to go. The void left by Naim and the absence of an infrastructure minister are likely to prompt questions about Kyiv's ability and commitment to protect its critical infrastructure as Russian forces continue to conduct airstrikes on Ukraine's power plants and mount offensives in the country's east. Two agency officials responsible for anti-corruption policy and procurement resigned with Naim on Monday. 6 Ukrainian and Western officials told the Financial Times that a series of firings, resignations, and government reshuffles directed by Zelensky in recent months had caused tension between Kyiv and its Western partners financing Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. So the global West, the hegemonic global regime, its financial partners, its international, transnational, investment partners, and business partners, all the people who have been supporting the comedic actor in Ukraine and giving him absolutely whatever he wants to defend Ukraine's extremely sovereign borders from Putin's very brutal invasion. He's not doing anything these people are telling him to do, and he just keeps asking for more money and, I guess, probably doing more cocaine. All of them told the FT that they had warned Zelensky and his government over what they saw as disruptive and inexplicable moves. And he was probably just like, well, yeah, I'm not a real or legitimate president anyway. The U.S. and other Western partners want a normal, predictable relationship with their Ukrainian counterparts. One concerned Ukrainian government official told the FT on condition of anonymity. Right now, they are losing trust in Ukraine's government because of personnel decisions that they do not understand. I wonder also if it has something to do with the fact that Ukrainian's government is like not a real government. And Ukraine, for all intents and purposes, is not a real country. It sends our partners a message that recovery is not a priority anymore, said Lib Vyshinsky, the executive director at the Kyiv-based Center for Economic Strategy. And so again, all the business opportunities that were going to be presented in Ukraine, the Build Back Better opportunities after the destruction was over, are evaporating. The partners are pulling out. It's like they think they're not going to be able to do their projects and then make all that money, which is weird because I was told Ukraine was winning that war and that Ukraine would win and that Russia would be defeated. In his resignation letter seen by the FT on Monday, Naim said he was stepping down due to systemic obstacles that, quote, do not allow me to effectively exercise my powers. Beginning last November, he said his agency faced, quote, constant opposition, resistance, and the creation of artificial obstacles, end quote, which he argued had, quote, a negative impact on the country's defense capability, cargo logistics, protection of critical infrastructure, and export of our goods. So that's 7 months ago. It doesn't sound like anyone is actually trying to win this war. That's not actually happening. 2 weeks before his resignation in late May, Naim gathered 24 representatives from the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and other Western agencies to tell them he expected to be fired and to have probes launched into the work of the infrastructure ministry under his ally, Alexander Kubrakov, the former infrastructure minister, according to audio obtained by the Financial Times and 2 people in attendance. Naim is heard in the recording assuring the agency representatives that the numerous projects in which they were involved, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, would stay on track, and he encouraged them to work with whoever replaced him. But several Western representatives aired their concerns about his looming departure. It's probably our most important partnership as we prepare for the reconstruction of the country and as we work toward this common goal of getting Ukraine back to business, getting exports flowing, said a woman representing USAID, who I guess also cannot comment. Naim's departure follows the dismissal of Kubrakov in May. The 2 men were in charge of Ukraine's wartime reconstruction, as well as the construction of the country's 3rd lines of defense fortifications to keep the Russians from penetrating deep inside the country. But 2 Ukrainian officials said that Kubrakov was viewed by Zelensky and his office as being too cozy with Washington. Zelensky's office has not commented on Kubrakov's dismissal, which was approved by the parliament. This situation is really bad for perception of the Ukrainian government and Ukraine generally. Ukraine is and has to be perceived as unbroken, Vishlinsky said. The sacking of Kubrakov and Naim's departure, quote, build an image of weak and unpredictable governance that is unjust to the efforts of Ukrainians during these years. So it seems that concerns are growing because the facts on the ground are unable to support the necessary narrative. Kubrakov's removal sparked a backlash from Ukraine's biggest Western backers in private and in public, according to the 6 Ukrainian and Western officials. Just 6 guys. Diplomats from G7 nations, as well as current members of the Ukrainian government, described frustration over what they said was internal discord and dysfunction, plaguing Zelensky's administration and government at a critical moment in the war. I cannot believe they are turning their backs on the comedic actor. I thought that this was one of the greatest leaders in world history. They told us he was Winston Churchill. And of course, not the real Winston Churchill, whose history you're not supposed to learn about, the mythological Winston Churchill, who is actually one of the saviors of the world. So we are told in the framing of the St. Petersburg International Economic Conference that the fact that the Western partners, the Western money, the Western investment is not flowing into Russia means that Russia is somehow a diminished state. They won't even mention the Ukraine war at these conferences, not because the war's not happening. In fact, everything but war is happening. It's just because they're so embarrassed. None of the Western partners, the Western money, the Western investors are going to show up. But 140 other countries will. And more major world powers are signing on to Russia's BRICS alliance. But the Western powers, the Western hegemony, the Western money, the Western investors, that's all that matters. That's how we know that Russia is failing. But wait a second, they're also pulling out of Ukraine. Now, I know that Ukraine is going to win. And Russia is going to lose. In fact, Russia's going to be destroyed because the comedic actor in Ukraine is the best leader the world has ever seen for generation after generation, honestly. And so I would never dispute that Ukraine would win. But also, it just so happens that Ukraine is failing on all the metrics that indicate Russia is failing. So wouldn't that mean that Ukraine is also failing? And the fact that the comedic actor in Ukraine is not doing the things that the Western powers, the Western hegemony, the Western money, the Western investors want him to do, well, that doesn't mean he's powerless. That doesn't mean he's on the other side. That doesn't mean he's incompetent. That doesn't mean he's illegitimate. In fact, he's very powerful. He's very legitimate. And he is winning everything but war because war's not happening, at least not with us, at least not until the authoritative source admits that it is. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!